minute or two recess to invite the GWP commissioners to come up and find a seat and Okay, we're coming back from recess, and I would like to call to order the joint meeting of the Glendale City Council and the Glendale Water and Power Commission. May we have the roll call for council, please?
Council members: Draymond.
Here.
Friedman.
Here.
Quintero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Mayor Najarian.
Here.
And may we have roll call for Glendale Water and Power Commission, please?
Commissioners Ajemian.
Here.
Armenian.
Here.
Chan.
Here.
Miller. President Yao.
Here.
Please read the item.
The item today for the joint public meeting, which was posted, the notice was posted in accordance to the Brown Act, the General Manager of Glendale Water and Power regarding water rates and revenue impact.
Thank you. Mr. Steiger.
Mayor Najarian, President Yao, members of the Glendale City Council, and the Glendale Water and Power Commission. I'm pleased today to come before you to offer an overview of our water utility. There are three major issues currently focused on in our water utility. One, of course, is the ongoing need for water conservation that we've had for quite some time. Secondly is a proposed expansion of recycled water. And finally is the discussion of the financial condition of our water utility and the potential for an adjustment in rates. Today, I'm going to focus on our financial condition along with some discussion of our operations. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we are looking to do today. I'm going to turn this over to our Assistant General Manager of Water Operations, Peter Kavonis, who will talk about operations. Bill Fox, our Assistant General Manager of Finance and Risk Management, will discuss the financial condition of our water utility. Peter Kavonis, again, will discuss our water rates as they currently are and as we're proposing for the short term. And I will finish our presentation with a discussion of comparative rates with our surrounding utilities and our planned actions moving forward. Overall, we are focused today on looking at the financial health and the financial condition of our water utility, as I've mentioned. And we have had and continue to have upward pressure on our costs and our rates. And some of the issues associated with that are energy costs that are required for pumping, not only from our primary supplier, the Metropolitan Water District, but from our own water supplies. The good news is that over the last few years, we've been able to increase our water supply from Glendale itself, which has offset the need for additional supply from Metropolitan Water. However, along with that goes additional cost associated with pumping in the wells in Glendale. Naturally, our costs from MWD continue to increase, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's been an ongoing increase and will continue in the near term. We have a continuing increased costs for regulatory compliance, the Safe Drinking Water Act being one of those, which requires additional treatment of our water. We've had additional costs associated with customer service and allocations from other areas of the city of Glendale that we depend on for services. The cost of treatment continues to rise as we use chlorine, ammonia, and many other chemicals. Cost of outside maintenance services, even though we're in a lower economic condition right now in general, many of the services that we use in our water utility are very focused, very specific, and there are only very few vendors. Therefore, they've taken advantage of the fact that costs can increase there. And finally, due to two specific reasons, we have experienced a significant drop in sales. One is the overall economic conditions that we've experienced over the last couple of years, and secondarily is the lower volume of water being sold to the residents and businesses in Glendale due to the economic conditions and water conservation. So with those in mind, it's reduced our overall economic picture due to decreased revenues, requiring us to take a look at what it will take to maintain a minimum level of service. And I want to emphasize a minimum level of service in the water utility over the next year. And we will present the details momentarily, but we are proposing a 3.8% net rate increase in water rates for the coming year. So to talk a bit about our operations and how they relate to this, I'd like to introduce Peter Kavonis, Assistant General Manager of Water Operations.
Thank you, Glenn. Good afternoon, members of the Council, members of the Commission. My pleasure to give you an overview on our operations. This is a slide that was presented to you during the budget review process, and it shows you the number of meters that we have in the system, and as the numbers have changed over the last 2 years. The key takeaway from this slide is that most of our sales are residential, and also that our number of meters is really not substantially increasing over time. We're a city that has pretty much grown to its relative to other areas to a pretty full extent, and our growth is slow and mostly internal to the city. A little bit about where our water comes from to meet the needs of the city. As an operating rule, we try to provide the lowest cost source of supply, and for us that is local groundwater along with recycled water. The existing recycled water system provides water to about 45 or so users. The ones that have been identified, we don't see necessarily other users at this point without a recycled water system expansion. Any year that we can hit between 1,600 and 1,700 acre-feet of water, of recycled water sales, we consider that a good year. Local groundwater comes from two sources. It comes from the Glendale operable unit as well as the Verdugo Basin. And the water that we cannot produce locally is water that we purchase from the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Typical percentage in the past, say in the mid-2000s and before, in the early 2000s, was about 70% MWD, 30% local. Through expanding the local groundwater and recycled water, and because of conservation as well. As you can see, this year we're about 55 to 45 on the mix of the two supplies. And this shows you a little bit longer history. It goes back to 10 years, and it shows how in the beginning fiscal year 2001, we were getting very little groundwater. As the operable unit kicked in, our groundwater has been increased to the level that it's at today, and our plan is to increase it further by drilling 2 more wells in the Verdugo Basin. You can see the total volume of supplied and how it's declined over the last couple of years, and how the Metropolitan Water District portion of that supply has been the one that shrinks. Net benefit to our residents for paying less for supply of water. Comparing water sales to water production, you'll notice there's a slight difference in the numbers. About 6.5% of the water that we produce does not pass through a meter and does not get billed. Compare that to a nationwide average of about 10%. We think we're pretty good, and we're continuously trying to improve that. Unmetered, unaccounted for water sales are not a good thing, so we're always trying to improve it. That number about 5 years ago was closer to 9%, so we're seeing an improvement. A lot of the projects that we've done, cleaning and lining of mains, replacement of mains, have resulted in lower unaccounted for water. The sales reflect the water production, so the percentages should be fairly similar to the slide you saw before. And the history of water sales going back 10 years is also shown here. Very notable in this slide is the decline in sales that we've had the last few years. Voluntary water conservation started in 2008. We had about a 4% reduction. Again, another 4% in 2009. About 12% this year, and we're forecasting staying flat the following year. Recycled water sales have been the same or slightly growing over time. No appreciable difference. The variation in sales in the years before is mostly attributable to weather patterns. You really don't see an overall increasing or decreasing trend. In a nutshell, that's the operations of the utility in terms of water production and water sales. And the next chapter of the presentation is the financial condition, and Mr. Bill Fox will do that presentation.
Well, good afternoon. This afternoon, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the financial health of GWP's water utility. I'm going to talk about a couple of the different rate methods that we use. We have 2 different ways that we report for accounting purposes. We have one which is the financial reporting method, which many of you are familiar with, that you see in the normal budget process as well as in the CAFR. And then we also have what's called the rate method, which is used as part of the utility rate design. So we'll talk about both of those methods. And then, in addition, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about our cash reserves, where we are today and where we anticipate we're going to be. And then finally, we'll do a little bit of a comparison of the 2 methods, the financial method and then the rate method. But before I get into that, I'm sure that many of you are probably aware that we just went through a rating process. There's 3 different rating agencies. There's one called Moody's, one called Fitch, and the third one's called Standards & Poor's. Well, on Friday, we ended up having our final review process with the Fitch rating agency. And there's some good news that I can report, and then there's some news that probably isn't quite as good. The good news is we were continued to be rated as a AA utility, so that's a very good standing. When you can think the best is AAA, and then it goes down from there, but AA is very outstanding. But the bad news is they rated us from what they call a stable environment to one where they called it a negative environment. They still left the rating the same, but they're kind of putting us on watch. And the watch happens to do with the fact that we're operating on thinner margins, and that we also are having to take a look at doing a possible rate increase, which is why we're here today. So some of those different reasons have resulted in the fact that they're taking a close look at us. They will be reviewing us again in the fall time frame, And at that point, they'll take a look at what actions we've taken and what more we need to do in order to either maintain that rating or improve it, or maybe it'll go down. But at this point, we're still AA, so I'm very happy to report that.
Mr. Mayor, if I can, Bill, the other two rating agencies, you mentioned there's three. Fitch is one of them, Standard &
Standard & Poor's and Moody's.
Moody's, and their ratings on us?
Their ratings are all comparable. Each of the rating agencies have slightly different methods in which they account for things, but in their eyes, we're all pretty much comparable.
They're comparable. They didn't raise the concerns that Moody's did.
At this point, what happens is that the rating agencies will look at us at different points in time. Right now, I've been exchanging information with Moody's, and they're asking a number of different questions, and they're asking for financial information. And then we also end up having to talk to them on conference calls in order to determine certain operational questions that they want to have answered. So the ratings agencies are doing this all the time, and there's surveillance on the utility, both the electric utility and the water utility, all the time, to make sure that we're maintaining the financial health that we need. This slide here is one that was presented by Mr. Steiger at the budget presentation that was done earlier. We're putting this up pretty much as a refresher. I think the important thing to note is that when we compare our budget from 2009 to actual 2009, from both a revenue standpoint and expense standpoint, you can see that we actually did better than we had budgeted from an overall bottom line standpoint. When we take a look at 2010, our budget, we actually had budgeted a $3.2 million negative budget. So we did deficit budgeting for 2010. And it was a result of the fact that we had enough reserves that had been established, and we wanted to not pass on a rate increase to the customers at that time. Taking a look at our forecast for this year, you can see that we're barely going to be in a positive situation. We're recommending that we're going to be at a $200,000 net income position at the end of the year with an operating margin of less than 1%. 0.5% is what we anticipate our operating margin to be. The budget for this upcoming year, 2011, is total revenues are budgeted at $40.3 million, and our expenses are at $40.2 million. So we're projecting that we're going to have $100,000 net income. And at that point, our operating margin has actually been reduced to 0.2%. So in essence, we're operating pretty much at a break even though we're anticipating going forth with a 3.8% rate increase. The method that I just showed you was the typical method called the financial method, and that's one that shows the different types of expenses that you would normally see on your income statement for both financial reporting purposes and for budget purposes. What we've done here is there's a second method that the utility employs, and that's called the rate method. And the rate method is basically breaking up your revenues and expenses into two particular components. The first component is, I'll go to explain, is the adjustable, which is the one that's on the bottom side. The adjustable relates to what I would call variable costs and variable revenues. Probably the most notable are our water purchases that we receive from Metropolitan Water District, also our own internal water production, and then our electric and pumping charges that we receive. So the bottom expenses and revenues here are what we call variable. In essence, it depends. These rates will fluctuate on how much water is being actually bought and how much water is actually being sold. The upper items, called base revenues and base expenses, you might want to think of those as fixed costs. Those are fixed at, no matter if we sold a number of units, less units, more units, those are fixed costs as part of the operation of GWP water section. Some of the more notable expenses in this category are the infrastructure costs. That's the cost of the pipelines, the reservoirs, and the maintenance expense to keep them in place. Our transportation and distribution costs, and then the customer service costs to serve the customers. So those costs are included in the base cost, And down below the variable is kind of like when you go to the gas station and you put gas in your tank. When you put gas in your tank, that's a variable cost to the gas station. They make money every time you buy gas, but they still will have a fixed cost of their operation. And the fixed costs are like the rent and the employee to take the money at the stand. So we're very much like that. We have a fixed cost and a variable cost. This next area is cash reserves. Back in 2006, GWP implemented a cash reserve policy. It was brought forth to City Council, and the policy guidelines were established for a total of $11.3 million of reserves that were set. These fell into three components: the operating reserve of $3.8 million, the contingency reserve of $6.5, and then the rate stabilization fund of $1 million. So the cash reserve policy or suggested guidelines for GWP is 11.3. This cash policy is reviewed on an annual basis, where each of the assistant general managers as well as the general manager will review the operating requirements and reserves that have been established. If we see that there's a need to change the reserve policy, then we will go forward to City Council with our recommended change. So at some point in time, if we want to either increase or decrease the reserve, we'll come forth to City Council and get their feedback so that we can make the necessary change. At the end of 2009, our reserve level, we had $14.4 million in reserves. We're forecasting at the end of 2010, so as of the end of this month, that our reserve level will be down to $3.8 million. So we've actually gone below our reserve policy suggested guideline. This year there's been some items that have impacted and have caused that reserve level to go below what our policy is. One is that we saw that there was an increase in the material cost related to the Chevy Chase reservoir as it was being built. There were some material costs that were above. The second was that we experienced a mainline break at Kenneth and Grandview, which was also another cash outflow. And the third is that originally when the budget was established, we went with what was called an AMR meter reading system, and then it was later determined that we were going to go to an AMI meter reading system, which is the large smart grid project that we're working on. With that change in project scope that was put together, that caused an increase in the demand for the reserve funding. So that's actually had an impact and reduced our reserves to below the level that we'd like. In order to accomplish getting us back up to the reserve level in accordance with our policy, our budget, we anticipate that will be at $6.7 million at the end of 2011. The intent was not to go back and try to capture all of the shortfall in any 1 year. We felt that it would have to take a 2 to 3 year process in order to get us back up to the cash reserve level. If we tried to increase it too much, then we'd have too much of an increase on the rates, and we felt that we could live with those existing cash reserve policy guidelines for this upcoming year. As I mentioned before, there's two different methods in which that you can identify and account for costs. One is the financial method, and the second is the rate method. The financial method for the year ending 2010, this is what we forecast our operating revenues to be, which is $38.3 million. We wanted to show you pictorially the different types of revenue that we will have. As you can see under the financial method, 90% of our revenues are from potable water sales. So this is for our residential as well as our commercial industrial customers. 90% of our revenues are coming from retail sales. We have another 4% that are coming from our recycled water sales. And then we receive on our bonds that we own, there's interest income that we receive of $300,000. And then we also have grants that we've received of revenues of $1.4 million. And then capital contributions of $600,000. Capital contributions are when somebody is doing construction within the city and they want to deed those capital improvements over to us, then we will take, based on the fair market value, the cost of that, and we will recognize that in revenue in the year in which it was deeded over to us. So for the financial method, you can see we have $38.3 million. The same answer is $38.3 million when you look at it from the rate method. Again, as I indicated earlier, we have two different types of rates. We have the adjustable rates, which are our variable rates, and those are based upon the amount of sales that we have of the water that we're producing that is actually sold. Revenues come from that. And then the second portion of the revenues are from the base revenues, and they're based on the fact that you have fixed costs. Those are the infrastructure costs, and the base revenues cover the infrastructure costs. Likewise, similar to the revenues, I wanted to show you the water expenses. This is where we anticipate being at the end of the year. $38.1 million in expense. As I showed you on the prior slide, it was $38.3 million in revenue, $38.1 million in expense, so we anticipate a $200,000 profit margin at the end of the year. Under the financial method, we wanted to show you the major components: the water production cost, the cost to produce the water, the transmission cost, that's the cost to transport it from point A to point B and to house it in our reservoirs, the customer service costs, that's for the billing, the call center, for the collection process, going out and doing meter investigations, the depreciation on our capital, all the capital that we have, there's a depreciation component, the interest expense on the bonds that we have, and then finally there's a city transfer of $4.2 million, which is 11% of our total expense. Similar to what we discussed on the revenue side, on the expense side, we've broken down the expenses into the variable or the adjustable expenses, which again relate to the water that we purchase, the water that we produce that's actually being sold, and then the base expenses are the infrastructure expenses in order to maintain the facilities that we own. That pretty much covers the financial piece. Next up, we're going to have Mr. Kavunas talk about water rates.
Good afternoon again. This is a refresher for Council. I know you're familiar with our water rate structure. It's a structure that's been in place for probably longer than a decade, and actually when that rate structure went into effect, it was considered fairly progressive because it had the concept of tiering, which allowed a lower rate for people that don't use as much water and a higher rate for people that use more water. So it did give that pricing signal for conservation. In today's environment, this is not considered as progressive as it once was. There are other structures, and Glendale eventually should consider one of those, although we're not proposing to do so at this time. As Mr. Fox described, our water rate components are the base charge and the adjustable charge. The adjustable is there to collect for the expenses we incur to purchase water from Metropolitan Water District, to pay for power, whether it's power that we use to extract groundwater or power that we use to push water around our system. And there's also another small component in there, which is any expense associated with groundwater cleanup in the San Fernando Basin, whatever isn't offset by contributions from polluters. The base charge includes two components. It has the meter charge, which is fixed depending on the size of meter. For example, a 1-inch or smaller meter in the city of Glendale is charged a fixed $13.60 per month. And then there's the commodity charge, which depends if a customer uses 10 or less HCF, 100 cubic feet per month, they pay 73 cents for each one of those 100 cubic feet. If they go over that, each additional HCF is $1.57. 3 years ago, when we talked about rate increases last, the average residential use was about 22 HCF. over time with conservation, we've seen the average residential, meaning single-family residential use, decline to 19 HCF. So that's, when we talk about a typical bill in today's presentation, we're considering a single-family residential that uses 19 HCF. With the existing rate structure, the average single-family residential bill is $61.45 per month. To compare the existing rates with the proposed rates, the proposed rates for an average single-family residential would increase from $61.45 to $63.80, an increase of $2.35 per month, or approximately 3.8%. You can see the change in the components. The adjustable rate would be reduced, the commodity charge would slightly increase, and the customer charge would also slightly increase, with a net effect of a 3.8% increase. If you were to take that as a unit for each one of those components, the next slide shows you what that translates into. And the change in the customer charge is from 72 cents per HCF, an increase to 82 cents per HCF, and so on. On a unit rate increase, the unit rate increase is 11 cents. Again, it's the same net 3.8%. Just a different way to, it's looking at it as a unit as opposed to a total water bill. In terms of a total water bill, the calendar year 2006 average residential customer, single-family residential, would use 22 HCF. And with today's rates, that 22 HCF would be $70.33 per month. Because of conservation, the average has dropped to 19 HCF, and as mentioned in the previous slide, that is $61.45. With the proposed increase, the existing average single-family residential would increase from $61.45 to $63.80, which is still lower than a bill would be with the existing rates at 22 HCF. Trying to give you a comparison that those that have conserved water have actually been seeing lower bills for the last year. With that, General Manager Steiger will walk you through some comparison of water rates.
And I'd just like to emphasize Peter's last point. And the last point was that even with a 3.8% rate increase, the average customer in Glendale will still be paying less for the water than they were prior to the implementation of conservation. So that's the meaning of that. When water utilities look to compare themselves to other water utilities, we look at a number of different items, including demographics, geographic orientation, weather, water quality, those things that basically compare favorably with other water utilities. So it makes sense when we do a comparison to compare with those water utilities that are in our surrounding area, and that's exactly what we've done here. We are looking at our surrounding utilities to compare these various areas, and since we're talking about water rates, the first thing that we're looking at, of course, is, as I've mentioned, Metropolitan Water, which is our major water supplier, will be increasing 7.5% their rates this year and next year. Other rate increases in our surrounding comparison, our next-door neighbor Burbank has just implemented a 13.5% increase. Pasadena, to our east, is proposing a 5.1% increase. LADWP is proposing an 8% increase. Crescenta Valley will be looking to the first of next year, 6 months from now, to implement an increase. And again, our overall proposed rate increase when compared to our neighbors is 3.8%. Now, if we look at the comparison today, before any of these increases have gone into effect, this is what we look at. This is Glendale in the middle. The average bill for Burbank, Pasadena, Glendale, Crescenta Valley, and Los Angeles, when averaged out, is $66.86. Glendale is currently below the average by $5.41, or 8.1%. So we are lower than the average of ourselves and the surrounding utilities. Now, this chart represents when all the increases go in effect. The comparison will then look like this, where Glendale is still below average. The comparative average at that level would then be $70.80. Glendale would then be below average by $6.99, or almost 10%. So we will be close to 10% below the average of our surrounding utilities. The average monthly bill increase is $2.35, or 3.8% for our average customer here in Glendale. So, what we are proposing to do is move forward with a Proposition 218 notification process, which takes 45 days. At the same time, we are proposing that we start to look at a complete restructuring of our water rates, which will take quite a bit of time, so that next year we would come back with a restructured water rate, which would be much more favorable towards water conservation, as Peter mentioned earlier. And that's more than just a rate increase. That's really looking at how rates are structured, how many tiers, how does it incent conservation, and so on. And that is a longer-term study, and it requires a great deal of data analysis. So we are proposing that we start that study shortly, come back in approximately a year, with a proposed rate design that encourages conservation. And then to close, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the discussion, we have two other issues that go hand in hand with everything we're talking about that we will come back to you sometime during the summer months. One is the continuing need for water conservation in Glendale and, in fact, in all of Southern California. All of our neighbors are doing the same. And secondly, we will come back to you with a very, very specific proposal on how we plan to expand the recycled water system here in Glendale and what the costs associated with that will be. So with that, I appreciate your time and certainly welcome your questions.
Thank you. Questions? Comments? Well, I just have a couple. Let me just start out with the most recent questions in the presentation. Why is there a Prop 218 notice required?
That's by law, by regulatory law, we are required to do that.
Okay, I think that's only for taxes. If it's a
No, it's properly related. If it's considered a properly related fee, which under Bighorn it is, we need to do a Prop 218 notice. We do that with sewer rates as well.
Okay. The next question is this just a one-year rate then that we're doing? If you're going to come back next year and talk about an alternative, more progressive rate structure?
We're going to come back next year with a completely reformulated rate structure. Whether or not that requires an overall adjustment in rates, we're not sure. At this point, the 3.8 is a one-year proposal, yes.
Okay. Ms. Friedman.
I'm wondering if you can elaborate just a little bit on the difference in what's reflected in the rates in terms of the hard costs of buying water and delivering water and administrative costs, and particularly if you can comment on how lean or not lean as a utility we're running. In other words, what is our percentage of administrative costs as compared to other utilities of similar size? Are there places we can find to trim on that side of the equation? Are there capital projects that you think are worth putting off until the economy recovers, or will that just add to a higher burden later on or less reliable water supply?
I'll answer that in reverse order. I'll start with the capital program. We had a very robust capital program on both electric and water that was connected directly to our 5-year strategic plan. In the last budget process over the last couple of months, we've had to adjust that greatly for both electric and water. But on the water side, we've had to push out many, many projects. And I'll ask in a minute, I'll ask Peter to come up and explain some of these projects. But in the budget that's already been presented to you for the coming year, we've already reduced the amount of capital expenditure for this coming year and for the next 5 years. We've pushed out a number of projects just because we don't have the revenue to support it. So we've also had to change our strategic plan, which we will come back at some point to integrate with that capital plan. So we've already done that, and it will mean that we've prioritized our capital projects, and we are taking only those that are the highest priority. The others have already been kicked out. Now, the interesting question that you've asked is, how will that affect us? And well, of course, over time, it will have an impact because our capital program relies on aging of the system and replacement of pipes and pumps and other facilities over time to recognize the aging of the system and to keep it current so that we don't experience any catastrophic failures. And again, we had a major water break last year that impacted our capital funding, for example. That's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid. So yes, it will have some impact. We are certainly hoping that over time, as the economy recovers, we will start to be able to bring back some of these projects into a tighter time frame. But for the current, in order to recognize the current conditions, we've had to push them out. On the operations and maintenance side, as it applies to the dollars associated with purchasing water and pumping water. Of course, that's a variable cost, as Bill and Peter mentioned. So those costs are varied depending upon how much we have to buy from Metropolitan at any given time. Our fixed costs, however, the administrative, the engineering, and the labor costs are quite fixed. And in fact, what we have done this year, we have eliminated many of the projects that would have been associated with that part of the expenditure. So we are now down to a very, very basic expenditure level, which maintains the system in a manner that is still gives the reliability that we have accepted as a standard here for Glendale, but does not go beyond that, does not increase anywhere in our operations and maintenance expenditures other than that we have to have, for example, water treatment, chemicals for water treatment, dollars for restoration when we do have repairs, and for the ongoing maintenance on a daily basis. But we have reduced greatly this year. In fact, there's a slide in here, we can go back to it if need be, that shows what our budget for this coming year is versus what it was even last year, which is already quite a bit below that. So it will have an impact.
And we purchase 56% of our water currently from Metropolitan. They're raising their rates 15% over the next 2 years, but 3.8% over 2 years doesn't equal. I was trying to do a little bit of the math, and I'm not the greatest math whiz. 56%. How much of our rate increase is passing along the rate increase for the wholesale price that we're paying for water? Someone can, I'm sure Mr. Fox or someone can do that calculation a lot faster than I can.
You have that. Yeah. I'll ask Bill to explain that.
The short answer is it's approximately $1 million per year, the rate increase for Metropolitan.
Percentage-wise. So if every dollar, if 56 cents of that is Metropolitan.
No, that's not true.
Okay, so I'm not doing this correctly.
The 56% that you took a look at on that slide is talking about all the water production costs and charges. Metropolitan Water District is approximately 63% of that 56% that you saw on that one slide that we looked at. Let's see if we can go back.
I don't think I'm phrasing this very well.
Okay.
I'm just trying to figure out how much of the 3.8% is proposed to capture that 15% increase that we're going to be paying, the city of Glendale will be paying for the water?
$1 million. So if you take...
What percentage of that rate
Well,
increase?
you're taking a look at the 7.5% times roughly, I believe it was $12.7 million that we spent. And we spent $12.7 million on Metropolitan Water District water this past year. If you take and you multiply that times your 7.5% increase, it's roughly $1 million. That's roughly what we're looking at. Is that the answer?
Let me try.
Mr. Starbird.
If you look at the table on page 18, you see the component of our rate per 100 cubic feet broken down into the adjustable rate and the base charge. The adjustable rate being the component related to the MWD purchases and electrical costs. So without trying to split those two out further, the $1.39 as a proportion of 324 is about 43%. So you could say that the 50% rate increase by MET is affecting 43% of our rate. Is that what you're trying to get to?
Right, because I'm wondering, if we don't have a rate increase, how does the city then absorb that 15% rate increase? Does that have to then come out of reserves? Where would that come from?
The answer is that it would either come out of reserves or we'd have to reduce our O&M budget.
Right. Mr. Steiger and his staff will either, and I've actually asked Glenn to prepare the Plan B, which is what if the entire rate increase requested isn't granted or only some portion of it is granted, but not the entire 3.8. What's your Plan B? What will be the implications of that? And the answer is it'll probably immediately result in additional use of reserves as well as the capital program suffering. What little bit of capital program we have remaining will likely continue to be pushed out.
Just so I understand it. So the choice is that if we don't increase rates to some amount, we then can't afford to pay for the water that we're buying from Metropolitan, or at least a portion of it.
No, I would not say that. We would have to prioritize our costs, take a look at all the costs internally, because buying the water that we need to serve the customers would be the first and foremost important thing that we do. We would have to take a look at our other operating and maintenance expenses as well as capital expenses that we would have planned and determine which one in priority that we would have to chop off the back end.
Okay, now I have a question then for Mr. Kavunas. What historically, has anybody looked at the connection between water rates and conservation? In other words, has anybody actually looked or done any kind of a study to say if rates are higher, people will use less of their discretionary water, let's say? Or has that analysis just not been done or not held up?
The analysis has been done. In short, the answer is the demand for water is fairly inelastic at the rate that is considered socially acceptable for water. Irvine Ranch Water District charges about $9 per HCF at the highest tier compared to our system average of $3 and something. And at that point, they're seeing some demand response.
Thank you.
I have 3 cards. Why don't we go to the speakers and come back to the commission and the council? Mike Mohill, Herbert Milano, then Bob Getz.
Mayor.
3 minutes.
Good evening, Chairman and council members, commissioners. Name is Mike Mohill, long-term resident, Glendale. I'd like to commend the council so far for asking the right questions to the GWP. Mr. Freeman, you hit some right good questions. I appreciate that. What concerns me is that there's only 3 people in the audience who came from the public to talk about this. I wonder why. Either they're working, collecting unemployment checks, or trust you to do the right thing. Last year, concerned citizens said that when water usage drops would happen, we said to the council, you're going to be coming back here and asking to increase the water rates. I was one of those people. I even wrote an article in the Glendale News Press. Silence for the next 12 months. Today we finally get notification of water rates increases. Wow, what a surprise. What has the GWP and the city manager been doing to prepare the public for this increase in water? Silence is what we've been getting for the last 12 months. Is that the way government's supposed to be run? In silence? How much overhead did the GWP actually reduce over these last several months? As they would say in the movie, show me the money. Did your GWP reduce their utility rates, staff, payroll, etc.? Where? Show me a chart where you actually went ahead and reduced. The numbers, you can make the numbers any way you want. Show the public. I'm the public. I can appreciate the fixed cost by the Metropolitan Water District to the city, okay? But the GWP has costs too. And where has the GWP reduced their cost? In private industry, when revenues drop, they have to do something different, like cut staff, cut overhead, cut utilities, cut. And I haven't heard a word called cut here. All I hear about is raise the rates. We'll go into the reserve accounts. Of course, we always can go with capital improvement because that's always last. Oh, speaking about capital improvement, let's go to the smart meters that Mr. Steiger came up here several months ago and said, we need it. $20 million, I recall, and you all approved it, $20 million. What if we didn't approve that $20 million? Oh, I forgot. The federal government came up here and kicked in about $20 million, but the rest of it is the GWP's cost. Is this called management by exception? Mr. Steiger knew what was coming up before us. So did our city manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mohill.
Thank you.
Herbert Milano, Bob Getz.
Mayor Najarian, Chairman Yao, members of the Glendale Water and Power Commission, and city staff. My name is Herbert Milano. 3 years ago, you declared a water crisis in Glendale, and today water conservation continues to be a significant policy issue for the city of Glendale. I believe that city policy, meaning the pricing for water, should be set up to support conservation. Probably one of the most important things I believe that you could do. The less we use, the lower the rate should be. But there's a problem. The problem is that for the Glendale Water and Power, for their own operational purposes, they have separated these costs into fixed and variable costs. And those things are pretty common to me. I use that all the time. We use base and adjustable costs, but the problem is that only 40%, a little bit less than 40%, of the actual cost given to the customer is variable. So that means that if you really wanted to incentivize water conservation through rate changes, the way it is currently structured, only 40% of that portion is really can be used for that purpose. And I think that's a problem. It is my opinion that all of it should be used in such a way that it is structured so that you embed all of these fixed costs right along with the variables and come up to determine what the actual cost per gallon would be. Now, we have another problem, and that's the problem that 70% of the residences in Glendale are multifamily. 30% are single family. So we learned today that single family residents are using about 474 gallons per day, 1,900 cubic feet per month. So if you translate that, it's 474 gallons average per day per residence, single family. I know that in my multifamily, we're doing about 190, less than that, gallons per residence per day. So that when you get a report, it is my opinion that you should get one report for single family with those relative costs and averages, and another one for multifamily. It's the only fair way to do it. When you mix the two, you don't get a good, clear picture of what the cost and the usages are. My suggestion is a significant restructure, that we can leave it revenue neutral for all intents and purposes, but I believe that a restructure where you have levels of 100 gallons per day, 200 gallons per day, 300 gallons per day, and so forth, be such that the more that you use, the higher your rate should be. It's the only fair thing to do for those individuals truly committed to conservation, and it's not what is allowed given the rate structure and the way you create your fixed cost and variable cost. Now, I have a couple of other comments, but I don't think I'll have the time to finish it, having to do with the way the income presentation is made and the way the recognition of the depreciation and how it could be used for capital improvement. Thank you very much. If you allow me another minute, I'll expand it.
No, not this time, Mr. Milano. Bob Getz?
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of Council, members of the Commission. I'm Bob Getz, and I'm a resident of Northwest Glendale. I would like to urge you this afternoon to think long and hard before you adopt yet another water rate increase. Even though this rate increase of 3.8%, and I should say proposed rate increase of 3.8%, is smaller than we had anticipated earlier, I think that if you go ahead and adopt that increase, that you will be creating some public trust issues, not only for the Commission, but also City Council. Now, I think the timing of this proposal is terrible. This rate increase would come on the heels of some very significant increases that ratepayers have been already paying for the last 3 years. 3 years ago, this council, by a vote of 3-2, put into place a 37% increase in water rates spread over 3 years. 37% over 3 years. That was about 13% per year. And on top of that additional revenue collected by those rate increases, there were additional funds going to the city from the 7% utility users tax. So, one would say it's always easier for the council to pass the rates because there's going to be an additional 7% tax on top of that. Those increases took place during the midst of one of the most severe recessions that we've had in recent memory. People in Glendale are suffering economically. And many of us are beginning to ask this question: when are you folks going to say enough is enough is enough? Now, GWP officials know very well that their ratepayers are suffering. On May 6th, there was an article in the news press, and GWP officials said that they were expecting to issue about 25,000 extensions, payment extensions. That's this year. People are having a hard time paying their utility bills. That's about 5% over last year and 20% over 2 years ago. So there are real problems out there, and this additional rate increase is only going to exacerbate that problem. Finally, why wasn't this issue discussed last week when council decided? I guess I'll have to this evening make my last point. It would be about 30 seconds, and it concerns a very favorite subject to some of us, and that's the rate, or these transfers. You want me to proceed, sir, or would you like me to come back tonight?
I think you've given us a little preview of what we can expect tonight, Mr. Getz.
Okay.
I do not want to limit you just to 30 seconds. I think you need
I could
time
do it in
to-
30 seconds.
Well, I didn't permit the other speaker
Okay.
to finish.
Very good. I can understand that. I'll see you this evening.
Okay, I have no other speaker cards on this item. Further discussion. Mr. Armenian.
I have a couple questions for Mr. Steiger. Mr. Steiger, as you install the smart water meters, that'll result in a wholesale scan of all the meters, of all the customer meters, I should say, including those that are perhaps not working accurately. What percentage of increased revenue do you expect from capturing losses from inaccurate meters or improperly functioning old meters?
Over the course of the next probably 2 to 3 years, by the time we completely implement, we are hoping to increase somewhere between 3 and 5% of the system through through more accurate metering, through finding meters that aren't working at all, which we've actually found in some cases. So it's somewhere in that range, yes.
And in the numbers that you presented, is that factored in or no?
No, because those meters will not be in place during this coming year. So that's why we'll come back with a whole restructure. But interestingly, given that you've mentioned the smart metering on the water side, it does link into some of the speakers' discussion on having rates that are much more conservation-oriented. Our smart metering will do that very thing because it allows for real-time understanding and manipulation of the customer, for that matter, of their water usage, something that they don't have today. So we fully expect to implement rates that will tie into the smart grid metering to allow for that very thing.
Ms. Friedman.
Can you remind us from your presentation during the budget workshop of what GWP's operating budget was for the last 2 years and what it's proposed to be next year? Because I think that some of the speakers had a very legitimate concern that this rate increase is going to overhead, GWP costs, transfers, all of that. So I think we need to maybe pull out a little bit in terms of what's going into administration and operating costs and what are those fixed costs that we have to recover.
We actually have a slide that shows that.
I think this is the slide that you were referring to. This actually shows over the period of 2009, 10, and our budget for 2011, what our revenues were. And for 2009, our budget to actual, you can see that our revenues were less, 43.9 versus 39.3 in revenues. So we had budgeted at what we thought was a higher level. Our expenses were actually less. If you compare our expenses for 2009, budget to actual was 42 was our budget, and our actual was 37.7.
And what was it in 2009? Your actual?
2009, budget 2009 versus actual 2009. So we actually did better than our budget as far as our expenses were less. Our expenses were 37.7 versus 42.0.
So it looks to me, and maybe I'm not reading this correctly, like the actual budget will be about $1 million less in 2010 than it was in 2009?
Our budget for 2009 versus 2010, our budget for 2009 was 43.9. Our budget for 2010 was 44.3. So it was almost a break even.
Okay.
For 2011, we actually decreased the budget, even though we're asking for a rate increase, to 40.3. So if you compare the difference between the 2010 budget of 44.3 versus the budget of 2011 of 40.3, there's $4 million less. Okay. So that means that we've actually cut costs.
So it sounds like GWP is cutting costs, and not to go through the entire budget presentation again, but where is that $4 million, where is that coming from?
It's actually coming from a number of different places. The water production cost, because we've actually sold less water, that is actually part of the equation. But through the budget process, each one of the divisions within GWP did a line item by line item budget analysis, and for both the electric and water side, and the goal was to try to have a break-even budget that compared to the prior year on the O&M expenses. So we tried to keep it down. As you can see, in this particular side, if you're looking at the 2010 budget versus 2011, there's a decrease of 40.7 to 33.4 in the operating expenses. So we are spending less money. We did do considerable cutting.
So if we're spending less money, why are the rates going to go up?
The rates are going up for the simple fact is that we haven't been collecting enough money. As we showed in our reserve study that we did, when we did the reserve analysis, Part of the reason that we're having the increase is the fact that, as we showed, our reserves have gone down. Our actual year-end reserves were $14.4 million. We're anticipating it to be $3.8 million. So we've actually, through capital expenditures as well as the expenses that we've incurred, are actually had put ourselves into a negative situation.
Okay.
Mr. Fox, go back to that slide again. I think you were...
This one?
That one. Okay. So, I mean, at one point you were on the very top line talking about total revenues, saying how you've reduced it from 44.3. The budget, you said the budget's reduced from 44.3 to 40.3.
That's correct.
You misspoke.
Okay. Apologize
that's
for
total
that.
revenues, correct?
That's the total revenues, which is
For the budget. But the question was the expenses and the operating expenses. So
Right.
we should be looking at the 40.7,
To the
which
30.
was the budgeted, but the forecast is 31.6.
That's correct.
And so for next year, we're going from the 31.6 to the 33.4.
That's correct.
So the question is, what is it in that 1.8 million that is necessary and cannot be done without? Is that the capital program that you're referring to?
Well, the capital program, you're only seeing part of the capital program in there through the depreciation. So if you take a look at the 31.6 versus the 33.4, you'd have to isolate on each of the components. The production cost, as you can see, that's all the variable cost.
Okay.
Is actually going up $200,000.
Okay.
The transmission cost, which is the cost of the lines, the reservoirs, and the maintenance related to those, is going up $400,000. But if you compare that to the budget of the prior year, it's actually less. Part of it's a timing issue. Part of what you do is, in some years, you anticipate doing a certain function, and it gets delayed, and it gets moved over to the next year. So you'd have to isolate and spend a lot of time in analyzing why a variance might exist between years, between the 6.2 and the 6.6. What we did is we did a bottom-up look at each one of our expenses on a line-item-by-line-item basis as well as project basis in order to come in with what we think is a very lean budget.
And I think that's the crux of our question here is, are we doing everything within the administration of the GWP and of your operating expenses that would be practical and feasible and responsible in terms of cutting and reducing and postponing that would necessitate this rate increase? I think that's perhaps the key issue.
If my colleague gets any answer other than yes, I'll fall out of my chair. So,
Allow me to perhaps put a little more meat behind the yes.
Let me say, what are we doing
Thank you.
to make sure that
We have a number of drivers that put upward pressure on our cost to do business, to keep the utility running. Part of what you see in those numbers, under production, you see the cost going up from 19.8 to 20. That includes a $1 million increase for MWD water. The fact that the number is only going up $200,000 is a reflection that we are cutting everything else so that we don't pass on that full increase. Cost of materials and supplies is going up. That's no surprise. That's no news to anyone. And the things that we buy are valves, meters, pumps, motors, parts, chemicals, and fuel, other than electricity. Some of our other cost drivers is the cost of services that we use to do our job. Simple things like getting a contractor to do paving whenever we have to excavate a street. Also things like specialized interior coatings for our tanks, which we don't have the expertise in-house, nor do we want to have it. Things like painting of tanks, fencing, landscaping of our facilities, and engineering services and specialties that we don't have in-house. And other cost drivers that increase, and that's shown in the customer services line. Customer services expense, after all the internal scrutiny, is still projected to go up from 2.3 to 3.0 million. Some of the things that we've cut, as the manager of your utility, of your water utility, I am not comfortable with this budget. To me, the budget that we have is a bare bones budget. We have contracts that we are not proceeding with. We have overtime that is only done on a pre-approved basis after scrutiny or on emergency overtime only, which is not very good use of employees. And we have deferred significant capital improvement projects that, in our view, are needed today. We have deferred over 93,000 feet of pipe that needs to be cleaned and lined or replaced in the system today. That pipe was spread out over the next 5 years of the CIP and at this point has been pushed off beyond that horizon. We have deferred projects like the motorized valve controls on one of our key pump stations. We have access roads that our staff use on a daily basis that are eroded and unsafe, and we put off the repair of those roads as a capital expense that is not as significant. We have also put off security enhancements and improvements to the system, the recommendations of the vulnerability assessment plan that we had done in 2003. So the cuts are real. And some of our cost control methods include prudent purchasing practices. For example, when we go out for a contract for water quality analyses, we don't go out for a contract on our own. We try to maximize the purchasing power of a bigger base. So we partner with Burbank and Pasadena and enter into the same contract for lab services. That's a significant expense for our operations. Same thing as our conservation approach. We have adopted the Tri-City approach, and we try to save money on the outreach for conservation. Managing our water quality on a more focused basis, I think you've all seen our brochure that captures how we've tried to, by spending a little more time and taking more measurements on our water quality, we can actually use less chemical. We buy less chemical than we did in the past and maintain the disinfectant at the right level. We have more consistent groundwater pumping through proactive maintenance of the pumps and strategic purchase of spare parts. If we have the spare part in hand, when a part breaks, we can replace it and get the pump back running, the groundwater well producing again quickly so we don't have to buy MWD water. We reviewed the backflow device program and made sure that the cost of that program is only borne by those that have backflow devices.
Did you know I was going to ask that question?
Well, it's a reasonable question to ask, what is your utility doing to control costs? And we're taking this very seriously. I mean, this is not an easy task to stand before you and ask for a rate increase. And I have to say, there was a comment made by Bob Getz regarding rate increases. And the reality is that, yes, the rate increases were in effect the last 3 years. But the reason you approved those rate increases the last 3 years is because the 6 years before that, there had been no rate increase. So we can be selective as to what we consider an average, but we've got to consider the whole history. There's a reason our rates are right smack dab in the middle of the rates in the region, and that's because of that history of time where we did not increase rates. I have a few more items, but I think you get the point.
I think we get the point. Ms. Friedman, then I'll go to the left side.
Just a quick follow-up. Explain this again, because a lot of numbers floating around. So, in general, we're going to be paying next year $1 million more for water for Metropolitan, for the city. How is it we're not passing all of that along to the consumer? We'd have to be raising the rates more than 3.8%, it seems to me.
Mr. Starbird described it well in terms of the percent, which is the answer I think you were looking for earlier. And the reality is that the MWD expense is recaptured through the adjustable rate. The adjustable rate floats along with the reserve that goes with it. So that adjustable goes up and it goes down as necessary. In the grand scheme of things, if our expense of met to met is going up, that cost will get passed along. Whether it gets passed along this year as part of the adjustable or next year because we have a little bit in reserves this year, it's still getting passed along at some point in time.
Sir Yao?
Yeah, I just want to comment that as part of the commission, we try to stress to GWP staff to look at all options before they consider a rate increase. And one of the long-term solutions, as Mr. Steiger mentioned, is the long-term tier structures. So right now we currently have 2 tiers, and that's very, I think, abysmal in my opinion. So hopefully in the long term, by next year, GWP staff will come back to us to look at different tier options, maybe a tier 3 or tier 4, where we reward conservations and penalize those who actually waste water. So that's the long-term solutions that I think all of us would be acceptable instead of a future rate increase.
And actually, it would be ideal if we could go to a water budget-based rate structure, which would be tiers after everybody gets in an allotment that is fair and equitable to their property.
Raymond? Oh,
I'll go right ahead.
Okay, I do have a comment. I understand we're estimating about $1 million increase for next year, but the Cal Green standards are coming in, and for City of Glendale, we have to implement them January 1st. And so please note that, and as you come back with the new rate design, make sure that you include the possible consequences of the new standards, which could be a higher percentage of conservation that's required, which will impact our revenue and also maybe some of your other programs, and that should be considered in your rate design.
Are you referring to the 20% by 2020?
20%, that's mandatory, but the city, the current Green Building Task Force is looking at additional 30% more, Tier 1.
Thank you.
Mr. Draymond?
Well, I have a question for Mr. Steiger. It's a general kind of question, Mr. Steiger. Suppose we were not sitting here talking about a rate increase. Suppose we were sitting here in the middle of budget discussions and the council had instructed the city manager to implement a 3.8% cost reduction across all departments. What would you be cutting right now? Now, certainly you wouldn't be coming back and saying, well, tax the ratepayer. What would you be coming back with?
We would eliminate all of our outside contractors. And we're very, very close, and I don't know if 3.8% gets us there or not, but we're very close, as I mentioned, to looking at workforce issues. So it would be contractors and then workforce. So we're close to that. We did reduce quite a bit this year. So we're already very close to that.
All right. And just out of curiosity, Mr. City Manager, with some of the issues that Mr. Kavunas, and maybe Mr. Steiger, you can address this too, some of the issues that Mr. Kavunas itemized, paving streets when there are projects and creating fire access or access roads, pardon me, and some of those things, why is it that in this economy our Public Works Department isn't doing some of those things, if they can be done more economically?
Well, Public Works focuses on its obligations. I think the fire roads probably relate to access to reservoirs, for example.
I misspoke.
So if it's water facilities, let's say they're cutting the street to replace a main or work on some valves, then they're obligated to patch the street when they're done, when they leave the work. Public Works doesn't come in and do it. Usually use a contractor.
No, I understand they don't. I'm asking why not? Especially since Public Works is seeing a reduction, too, in funding in certain ways, and presumably,
Well, you have to pay for it one way or another.
No, I understand.
I mean, the costs are allocated where the costs are incurred, so GWP as an enterprise should be bearing the costs that relate to its operations, and Public Works bearing all those other costs that are general fund related.
Because you do understand those questions come to us when new street lights are installed, for example. Right. And we often hear, or at least I assume everybody gets emails about that. Gee, why are we hiring an outside firm to do that? Why aren't our own folks doing this? Those are the kinds of questions we hear. I want to address something that Mr. Getz raised. I agree with a great deal of what Mr. Getz was saying. The only exception I take was that that vote that he referred to 3 years ago, and I know better than most because that 3-2 vote you mentioned, that was me that broke the tie on that, to vote in that increase. I'll cop to that. But Mr. Getz, that was not during or in the midst of the worst recession. There was no recession that we knew of at that time. That I think I had, frankly, only been on the council a matter of months at the time, I think. In any case, and that was an excruciating vote to make, let me tell you. I made that vote for the reasons that were actually itemized by Mr. Kavunas in response to, I think, Mayor Najarian, as to exactly where those funds are going, and the fact that, as Mr. Kavunas pointed out, for a period of years, we weren't maintaining that infrastructure at all. My comments at the time were that the presentation made was, and I'll clean it up a little bit, overly dramatic in their nature. But in any case, other than that, I agree with most of what you were saying, Mr. Getz. There was a comment made, and it wasn't lost on me, but there was a comment made earlier about the people who are conserving water. They're actually, well, now they're consuming less water, so they're actually paying less. They will actually be paying less. And that strikes me as not at all apples to apples. Well, yes, they're paying less. They're consuming less. They're conserving. That's the whole idea. So, I mean, in a way, that's like me saying, Mr. Steiger, meet me out at the track, and I'm going to march you around the 1 mile track, and then we'll stop, and then I'll cut off one of your legs and march you around the same track again and tell you that you went around the track half as far. It's just not an apples-to-apples comparison. Well, yes, of course, they would be paying less. They're consuming less. In my lifetime, I have never heard any municipality come forward and state, after a mandatory or volunteer conservation measure, anything other than these words. Well, the public responded to a larger percentage than we thought they would. They conserved more. By gosh, they're on board and they're responsible. Well, yes, consumers are responsible, and our residents in Glendale are exceedingly responsible, and they resonated to not only the voluntary measures but also the mandatory ones. And instead of a 10% compliance, we got 18% compliance. I have never in my life heard anything other than the municipal utility come forward afterward, whether it's Glendale or Los Angeles or anywhere else over the years, and say, and therefore we have to raise the rates because, after all, we're selling less water, or we're selling less electricity, or what have you. So 76% residential sales. So are we to anticipate that as our residents continue to respond conscientiously to environmental and conservation issues, that we will be continued to ask to approve increased rates? Because, I mean, isn't one of our goals as a council to encourage our residents and our ratepayers to continue to be conservation-minded, environmentally, to run their households in a more environmentally friendly way? So does that mean that we're going to be reconvening over and over and over? Because presumably they're going to continue to conserve. You're going to sell less water. You're going to sell less electricity, theoretically. So at what point do we stop? At one point do we say, well, as the city manager has said, we were talking about budget. The goal is not to provide less and less service. The goal is to provide the services at a lower cost. I don't see increasing the tax burden on our ratepayers as doing that. Just my opinion, and I don't expect to persuade anybody. And I haven't been out there trying to persuade anybody. It's just my opinion. This 90% that you show on page 15 of this presentation, potable water sales, 90% makes up 90%. So the more efficiently our ratepayers run their households with regard to water use and water conservation, do we anticipate larger and larger taxes? For me, this is not. I'm just not convinced that this is the time and the place. And I know what happens when you say this. When you say this publicly, as I said to the paper, and they published it, I know what the response is going to be. There's discussion about that, and then someone comes before the podium at a staff presentation and says, yeah, but it's only, $2 or $1 more, or $3 more per month for the average ratepayer. But I don't feel comfortable doing this after voting for basically a 12.33% increase per year for 3 years, that 37% that Mr. Getz was pointing to. And the most compelling argument for it is not the one where your staff comes forward and says, hey, it's rate envy. You know, every other municipality charges more. To me, that's not a justification. The most compelling argument I've heard is from my colleague, Councilmember Friedman, who was talking about MWD and the cost of water there. But then again, it looks like it's about $1 million, and I wonder what the priority is. Is it, yes, we would lose some capital improvement if we made a reduction elsewhere, but I guess that's what the council has to grapple with, and the commission to an extended extent. What are those priorities in this kind of economy? I don't give anybody the wrong idea, and this is the only time I'm going to blather about this, so forgive me, Mayor Najarian, for my going on like this. But just so people don't get the wrong idea, I have not consumed some magic Kool-Aid out there on the subject. I'm not ruling out the fact that I would support an increase for a utility rate, or I would oppose all increases. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this issue and the sense to me that this is going to be the start of an incremental increase this year and the next and the next and the next and the next. And I'm not convinced I know what the end game is here. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Ms. Friedman.
Thanks. You can sit down, actually, Mr. Steiger. Just a few comments. First of all, I think all of us know, I'm sure all of us know, how difficult it is for people out there right now. I mean, I feel it personally in my household, and I know everybody else does. And yes, for most people, this is going to be a $2 a month increase, which for a lot of people is the cost of 2 bottles of water. You pay a lot less than that for the water that comes out of your tap. But I would also never assume to know where that breaking point is, or that straw on the camel's back, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And for some people, that would be an impact, or a big impact. And fee increases they add up. So it's a couple dollars here, a couple dollars there, and that can lead to big trouble for someone. So I understand all of that. And I also understand the suspicion of the public that rates are going up because we have a bloated utility that's living high on the hog, and that's where the money's going, that it's not being spent responsibly. But honestly, I don't see that here. I see a department that's come in during the budget study sessions showing us a decreased budget, a department that's cutting a lot of programs, that's cutting a lot of the fat. I mean, can they cut more? Probably. Everybody can, and I'm sure they'll continue to look for that. But for me to think that that's not the case would mean to believe that this department's out of control or they're lying to us, and I just haven't seen any evidence to that. There's a moral argument that can be made, or a hypothetical argument that goes something like this. We've all done a great job at conserving water, and therefore we shouldn't have to pay more for it. And that makes some kind of sense in a hypothetical, abstract, moral kind of way. But we're not dealing with morals here. We're dealing with a commodity. It's not a fee, and it's not a tax. It's not something that's arbitrary. I could say, well, the city puts a certain amount of money on something like an inspector coming to my home, and maybe they can justify it, maybe they can't. But this is a commodity that we have to buy most of on the open market. And we do not have control over the cost that we pay as a city for that commodity. So we don't get to sit up here and decide 100% what these rates are going to be. If we cut GWP's budget to 0, you're still going to have to pay for that water. So the difficulty here for me is sussing out how much of this increase is, why I was asking all those questions, is to see how much of that has to do with a commodity and what we're paying for it. And a lot of it does. We heard $1 million a year. And that's going to continue to go up. People don't think much of paying $3 for a gallon of gas. Or they do think much of it. I mean, that's just a lot of money. We're talking about a rate increase that's less than 1 gallon of gas. But people say, oh, but we understand gasoline costing money. because people fight wars over it, and it's a scarce commodity, and it's hard to get, and it takes a lot of energy and money to get it out of the ground. You know something? Water does too. Countries go to war over water, and we're going to see more of that as there's less of it. It's a very scarce commodity, even though we don't treat it like it is always. It's difficult to get from where it's found to your tap. So we have to recognize that it's not a moral decision. You conserve more so you get to pay less. You conserve more because there's less of it. And the price is going up because there's less of it. And that's just a reality that we all have to face. Now, we can also say, because you're conserving, you should not have to pay more, because it's like, you should be able to basically buy your way out of spending a lot. In other words, I don't want to pay a lot, so I just won't buy any water. But if you stop thinking about water coming to your home just in terms of how much you may use at any given time, and remember also that there's also a hard cost just to make it available to you. So even if you get all your water from Sparklets and it's delivered to your house, there's still a cost for GWP to bring that line to your house, to maintain it, to clean the water so that if you turn the tap on, it's there. So you pay whether or not you're using less or not. Now, I do agree that people that are conserving should have a different kind of tier. I think that makes a lot of sense. I know that's going to be difficult, and it's been tried before, but I think there's more of the will to have that happen. I also worry about artificially keeping the cost of water low. MWD has done that in the past, to try to keep the cost of water low, and how that relates to conservation. If you're not paying for something just as the commodity that it is, the scarce commodity that it is, does that then lead to what I see in my neighborhood all the time, which is, as much as we talk about how expensive it is, still half the people in my neighborhood clean their driveways by hosing them off, even though they're not supposed to. They water to where water is running down the road because their irrigation systems aren't properly adjusted. So, yes, there are a lot of people that are conserving, but there's a lot more people that are wasting a lot of water. And if they were really so concerned about these rates and what they're paying for water, they wouldn't be doing that. If it was gasoline and they were paying $3 a gallon for it, do you think it'd be running down the streets? No, but it is. So I just don't believe that, people are out there, that everybody is conserving as much as they can, and that everyone's hurting over their water prices. If they were, we wouldn't see the abuses that we do. And by the way, that's not to say that people aren't doing a lot. 18% water reduction in a year is huge, huge. So it's a sea change, and people are coming around. They really are. They're getting the message. And they're going to have to keep getting it and get it even more, because they just not making any more of it out there. Anyway, I wrote a whole bunch of stuff down, but my handwriting is so bad that I actually can't read it. So anyway, those are just some thoughts. And if GWP has ways of cutting their costs and their administration even more, I would love to hear them as we go along, and we'll keep looking for that. In terms of what employees are being paid, I know that's on a lot of people's minds. We're in the middle of negotiations that includes GWP employees. We are doing the best we can to bring those costs down. But I don't see a department that's bloated. I don't see a department that's out of control. I see a department that's really taking this seriously, that is bringing us a proposal of an increase that's a lot less than what's going on all around California, just a lot less.
Can I break in a minute? We have members of the audience that are submitting cards to members. That's the second time that's done. I don't find that appropriate. He had the opportunity to speak at the podium, and that's enough. Excuse me.
That's okay. I'll take that as being rescued. I'll give it a rest for now. And those are just some thoughts, and I'm not exactly sure where this is going, but I'm interested to see what they come back with, and we'll do the best we can.
Mr. Weaver, then Mr. Draymond. And I just want to remind everyone that this is a study session. We are not going to be taking a vote on this. It's a time to ask questions and get information and for a little argument back and forth. Mr. Weaver.
Just a couple of general statements. People seem to not recognize the difference between the private sector and the public sector. in the private sector, for instance, if you're an automaker and you can't sell cars, you close down and you lay people off, dealerships, whatever. A public entity serves the public, you, the taxpayers. And therefore, it's a stable workforce for the most part. You can't simply eliminate costs, which would then take customers offline or reduce the time they can respond to you. You have production costs, costs of materials, whatever, are consistently going up. And you have to be able to handle that. You have to be able to serve the public. That's what we're here for. A lot of people don't seem to understand the difference between the two. Many other cities are also living with lower rates because they're using their reserves. Just look at LA. Keep going into your reserves so you don't have to go face the public and take the wrath of the public to adjust the rate when you do. Sometimes you get into the problem of they put off the rate structure. I don't want to increase the rates so the public could be in there. Let the next council handle it. And then somewhere down the line, what happens? You find out you used up your reserves, you're barely there, you have water pipes breaking all over your city. Now you got to jack up that rate structure more than 1%, 2%, or 3%. Maybe it's 10% because you've been playing a game, been using the reserves so the public won't come in and attack you. Leave it for the next joker sitting up here on any council. That happens all the time. I think this is reasonable. We have to build up our reserves. I know when Mr. Starberg got here, we found a number of different programs where we didn't have reserves set aside. Water is no different. We have to build back our reserves. We've got blowouts, other things that we've had to spend our reserve money on. Now you got to build it back. It's not a question of any department getting fat. I've sat here and I've gone through 14 budgets now. I listen how we have cut. When I was working for the Army Corps of Engineers, 37 years, I kept hearing every year on the budget, you've got to get more efficient. You've got to do more with less. When does it stop? You can only do so much. I happen to think we have a lot of good workers in this city. I believe that we have sufficient audits of operations, whatever. I don't think that people are getting away with games down here, getting flush and taking trips and doing all this stuff. No, not in my mind. Staff, our professional staff, who have degrees like crazy, say that we have to do something. I think they're giving us a straight scoop. For those that don't have the background in the fields to get up here and argue that we're taking it to the public, it's a wash for me. That doesn't work with me at all. When this rate structure comes back, I'll be voting for it because it's the right thing to do at this time. Not that I like doing it. Excuse me? Yeah, I'll keep an open mind. I might vote for 5 or 6. I might vote for 1. Whatever comes back, if it's justified, then I will support it. That's my job as a councilman, being fiscally responsible for the assets and the money in this city. Thank you.
Any other comments, Mr. Draymond?
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of comments. I don't think anybody has sat up here and accused GWP of being a fat department. That's just a straw man. No one has uttered those words up here that I noticed. And unless I missed a GWP commission meeting somewhere, I have never heard that from any of our commissioners either. Now, you do occasionally hear that from the public, but not from anybody up here. So to say it's not, as though someone has said it is just this. It's just yapping. Let's be honest about the conservation. Most of our ratepayers conserved because it was mandated that they do so, and because they were asked to do so by their city and their utility, and they're good citizens, and so they did. But let's also be honest. When we asked them to do that, we didn't say to them, oh, and by the way, when you conserve, ultimately and inevitably, as with every municipality who has done this over umpteen decades, you'll be paying an increase in your rates as well. So we want to talk about morals. Do we have the obligation to also add that fine print, not as fine print, when we know it's coming to our ratepayers as well? I would only add two more things. One is fees and taxes are not arbitrary, but they are still nonetheless fees and taxes. Increases may not be arbitrary, but they're still increases nonetheless. I want to tell the public that if they should listen very carefully to what Councilmember Friedman stated, because it's a very good, I don't agree with a lot of it as rationale to raise rates, but I do agree with it completely as a very fine argument for why our structure, our process for this is regressive and not a progressive rate system. In other words, if we were charging more for the guy that puts in the house way up on the top of the hillside that costs more to deliver services to him than the guy who's in the middle of the block where we're already delivering services, or the guy who we charge more to the guy who is washing his driveway down with a hose and not conserving, then we do have a more progressive system. But we don't have that, and that's not what's being suggested right now.
Attention amateur photographers. If you live in Glendale, Montrose, or La Crescenta, you can participate in the My Hometown Photo Contest. Color and black and white photos are being accepted now through July 22nd. One winner will be selected from each category and will be awarded $250 for the best.
We need to do. But I just want to make it clear, I'm not saying I think that they have some ulterior motive. It's that our job as elected officials is not simply to sit here and hear from them and say, yep, I'm guarding the public treasury, so we should do what they say. Our responsibilities are much broader than that. We're also protecting the interests of 207,000 of our residents, even when they can't come here. You know, sometimes the hardest thing is to protect the interests of people who are apathetic and don't show up to express themselves. But nonetheless, we have to do that. So it is about prioritizing, and so we'll see. We'll see when this all comes back.
Thank you. Yes.
Just a few comments. And this is really regarding the timing. I think the timing, as what was mentioned, is a huge issue. If this was if this was 2005 and everything was booming, this may not have been a bigger issue as it is today. The fact of the matter is, if people are late on their water and power bill, that is the last bill that they don't pay. They don't pay their credit cards, they don't pay other things, and the water and power bill is the last thing you don't pay, because then you don't have water or power. So it means that the public is hurting. And the reasoning suggested for the not the reasoning, but I would say the method of providing an increase because we had more conservation than planned for is just not justifiable in my mind, and I think it presents a slippery slope. And as more people are going to be conserving more and more throughout the years, this is going to be an issue. It has to be resolved in another manner. What that manner is, I don't know as of today, but I think it has to be in another manner, in another maybe multi-tier system, which will be presented in a year from now. And it's so the overall process of how this is going to be increased, or the reasoning why it'll be increased, because we had more conservation, and therefore we should increase it and penalize the people for saving, is just not justifiable. And there probably is another way. It's just going to take more time and work to figure it out.
Yeah, my worry is not so much about the need or the justification to balance a budget to make sure that we have sound accounting behind our operations, but I worry that we don't assign a value and a price on the issue that Mr. Getz brought up, which is about public trust. And I don't mean that from the perspective of whether or not we trust that our utility is doing everything that it can or putting forth valid numbers, et cetera. I mean that more from the worry that I have about a mixed message situation that we currently have, at least on an interim basis. And what I mean by that is 2 Sundays ago, the LA Times puts out a front page article in their Sunday paper about how water levels are up. Today, we're talking about potentially raising rates and essentially penalizing people in a kind of an upside down way for going beyond our expectations on conserving. And they're already getting hit with other types of increases. We're increasing, for example, the trash rates. I wonder whether there's any way to consider looking at a more fundamental solution, biting the bullet in a short term rather than nickeling and diming to try and balance the budget for an immediate short term, and look at a structure, a rate structure that does truly reward those who conserve, penalizes those who don't, and puts us on a kind of more of a long-term path on how to deal with this situation that's going to be with us for a long time. It's not that I necessarily believe that our problem is over by reading an LA Times article, but nonetheless, it's a variable that we don't control year to year in terms of how much rainfall we get and how good the weather is. We just happen to have gotten lucky, I think, this year. But at the same time, I'm in the public relations business, in specifically the utility space, and I don't think we can underestimate the issue of having a trusted relationship with the public that we are here to serve, and making sure that we don't undermine that trust and fuel the skeptics who say, you know what, we don't have a problem here. That's just a way for them to hit us with more rate increases or whatever the irrational statements that might be out there. I'd rather really come back with a more fundamental long-term solution that looks at this, if there's a way to bite the bullet in the short term. Not at the expense of, for example, endangering our ratings through the financial ratings agencies or other more difficult situations. But nonetheless, I don't like the approach of a nickel and dime approach where you come and hit them with 3.8% now, and then you're going to come back with a fundamental rate design, a year later that may, who knows, may hit others in even more increased ways. I'd rather come back to them and say, here's a long-term problem, here's a long-term solution. Maybe in the interim we do some public education about where that 3.8% is going to come from in the short term in order to get us to the long-term solution, which might be more than 3.8% in fact. But at least at that point you've got a rate structure that is rewarding those who conserve, penalizing those who don't, and that way it's a more fundamental solution. Thank you.
Mr. Quintero, then Ms. Weaver.
Okay. Well, I voted no last time, and of course I'll have to keep an open mind, as Mr. Howard, the city attorney, points out. But one of the reasons I voted no in the past was the fact that we didn't have a multi-tiered system in terms of the rates. And I didn't feel we were doing enough, or Glendale Water and Power specifically was doing enough to encourage conservation. Now, in terms of all of the multiple details that were pointed out in the presentation, one thing that strikes me is when we talk about cost drivers, contractors, materials, etc., are rising. I don't know why they're rising. They're certainly not rising in the general economy. And we are also involved in labor negotiations, so I think we're a little bit premature in terms of pricing at this point. But the big thing for me is that we've gone to the residents with a conservation proposal. They responded far beyond our expectations, and we are going to raise their rates. And that, to me, is counterintuitive. I don't think that makes any sense at all. The MWD increases are real, and it's something that we have to deal with. And as a general proposition, I would say that Southern California in general does not pay the real rates associated with bringing water to the south. But that's nothing that we're going to solve this afternoon. I think we have to move as quickly as possible to do the study, to go to a new plan with different tiers, multi-tiers, which makes it much higher for large retail users and large residential users, large commercial users, and just do everything that we can to encourage conservation. If you don't use much water, whether you live in a single-family home or wherever you live, if you don't, or a building that doesn't use much water, then they shouldn't be paying a higher tier of rates. The more you use, the more you pay. It's as simple as that. If you have a large yard, like some neighborhoods that have huge green expanses of lawn, you're going to have to either decide you want to pay to keep it green, or you're going to go to a different type of landscaping and do the kind of things that we should have done long ago, once again, here in Southern California. So at any rate, if a vote were taken today, I think legally I can say this, if a vote were taken today, I would vote no. Let's see what plan the new tier would propose and what GWP comes up with, but we have a lot more work to do.
Yeah, just one last comment. I think this has been a very productive afternoon, a very productive discussion. It's a very big and complex issue, something that I'm still learning about. It's a huge learning curve when you start getting into water and water pricing and water rates. And so I hope that for people who have been watching, it explained some of the mysteries behind how the rates are set and why they go up and why they go down and all of that. And I'm hearing a consensus up here, which I would echo, about going to a tiered system with a lot more tiers. And in a perfect world, if we could come up with something where people that have done the maximum of reduction see no rate increase, and then people that are not conserving or haven't changed see the most rate increase, that's what I would really like to see. And my question is, for, I guess, Mr. Kavunas, will smart meters give us the ability to do that in a more efficient manner? I know it's complicated. I'm hoping that the smart meters will help us do that tiering and do that kind of tailoring so that we can really know what people should be using, what the averages are for lot size, household size, all of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. That's one of the key benefits of the AMI.
Okay. And when do those come online?
Well, the proof of concept is already installed. We're looking to start installation of the rest of the system late in the fall, I believe October this year.
October. So if there's some way that we can do this in conjunction with the meters and use that technology so that, again, the people that are doing the most conservation don't see an increase, and that we do find a way of encouraging better conservation amongst the people that are wasting the most water, that would be what I would love to see.
Mr. Mayor, if I can, and I recognize that you haven't spoken yet, recognizing that you're all keeping an open mind, if indeed we went down the road to a 218 hearing, there's a question of whether or not we should proceed with that next step. If there's a majority of you who thinks we should be taking a different approach, a la not proceed with this planned rate increase, not proceed with the 218 notice, but come back again and talk about rate structures before we take the next step, then frankly we're better off knowing that now than we are after we do the 218 hearing, because we'll be noticing every customer in the city, all 70-some thousand of them, with the proper notice and all the legal mumbo-jumbo that we have to give them. And then you're going to have a number of people down here talking to you about that. If there's a feeling now we should take an intervening step before we do that, we're better off knowing that now than we are after we notice a 218 hearing. So although you have to keep an open mind, we want you to do that. If we were to have a 218 hearing, if there's an intervening step you think we should be taking, then we're better off hearing that now.
Mr. Quintero.
I would say no 218 hearing.
Mr. Mayor?
Sir Weaver.
How long is the estimate to do this? I mean, I support it too, but is this a 6-month, a year?
Can I just comment on that for a second? Because you've talked about the smart meters and tiering depending on consumption. There's also other methodologies that the water people can talk to you about. For example, if you live higher up on a hill, it costs us more to get you your water there. And so there could also be a portion of tiering that relates to, there should be a portion of the tiering that relates to what water zone you happen to be in, because electricity is becoming a bigger and bigger component of our rate structure. So talking about those things, in addition to conservation, could also be part of that discussion.
Well, you know, my thoughts, and there are many things that we spoke about, but what I think what I'm a little bit troubled with is the belief and the faith in almost everyone on here that a new tiering structure is going to be the panacea, is going to be the cure-all. And I'm telling you, it is not going to be the cure-all. Those folks who live in homes, who live in Northwest, who say, I've got to water my lawn, city, you're telling me I've got to keep this green. We can't put artificial turf in. I've got 4 kids in the house. Why is my bill all of a sudden a 20, 30, 40% increase? The apartment owners who say, well, I've got apartment owners and I can't meter each unit, and why do you hit me with this huge bill for? I mean, if you think that the outcry of 3 individuals today over a proposed 3.8% increase is something to think about and consider and take to heart, you wait till you put forth, I mean, I urge you, go out and put forth a tiered system where the people that live in the hillsides have to pay more than the people that live in the flatlands. I mean, you want revolt in the city, try a tier like that. Try a tier with, people that have the same, people that live without children are getting a benefit, lower rates than people with kids. People that are on dialysis that need additional water. I mean, once you get into this tier system, you're going to be, and there's many ways to do it, but when you're talking about total water consumption, these are factors that have to be considered. There seems to be an outcry against new development. Are we going to have the latest development in the system pay for the entire cost of the new piping that has to run from the street, down the street to their homes? I mean, believe me, this tiering system is not going to solve problems. I think it's going to create more problems than a 3.8% across the board increase is going to provide. I'm open to proposed tiers, but I think before we all put our faith in that and say scrap this across the board increase, we need to see what the real effects are going to be. I think there's going to be, for every person that has a lower bill because they have conserved, there's going to be additional, much higher bills for those that can't conserve and that are restricted on the limitations that they can put in their water use. So all I'm saying is watch out. I think we've got problems ahead larger than a 3.8 across the board increase.
Mayor, I was going to, because Mr. Starbird asked a question. My logic was going, how long estimated to do the 2-tier so we can have a study session, even find out the impacts like you're talking about, as opposed to acting on a rate increase now. If it's going to take a year and a half to do a study, I don't know whether we can afford to wait that long before we go forth with a public hearing on what we've been presented with today. So how long would timing issue. How long will it take to get a study just to begin studying it?
It will probably take somewhere at a very minimum, and I'm being advised to not say this, but nonetheless, 6 months to 9 months, okay? And probably closer to 9. And a lot of it has to do, it sounds simple, but it's not. The amount of data that has to be analyzed and the amount of consultation that we're going to have to go out and retain to do this is substantial. This is a whole, as the mayor has pointed out, it's a whole new way of looking at rates. And it is something that we're going to have to do anyway. But what we're trying to do is do it properly and integrate it with Smart Grid, because the integration with Smart Grid is key to what we're doing here, because it will allow users to have a much, much keener understanding of what they're using.
Okay, so you take 9 months, then we have to notice everybody, I guess, or whatever. It goes to the Water and Power Commission for studies. It goes back and forth. Before we could even get here to talk about, as a council, whether we want to go that way and send staff back for changes again, I bet you it's 1.5 to 2 years out. And I don't know whether we can afford to wait that long on possible action on rate increase.
Well, our proposal, because we do agree that that we have to look at a complete restructuring of rates. There's no argument regardless. But in order to do it properly, it'll take that long. It'll require because of, if we don't integrate it with Smart Grid and we do all this work and then let Smart Grid come in, then we will have wasted half of that work. So that's why we're trying to time it to when Smart Grid comes into play. And it should, we expect that Smart Grid will be completely available within this city by September of 2011. So a little more than a year from now, which is why we wanted to do this complete restructuring study in the longer term. But if you'd like us to come back, we can certainly come back with a restructure, but it will take some time.
Mr. Draymond.
Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to state for myself that my interest in a multi-tier rate structure, that I don't view it as a panacea. I view it as something that is the right thing to do and the responsible thing to do. And I agree with you that it is going to create, it's going to engender a lot of heated discussion. Remember that when we talked about a 10% across the board, you'll recall Mr. Kavunas was here at that time saying, at that time what was being suggested to us was based on usage, if you remember, with conservation. We opted for 10%, a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday approach. Because we felt that it was, that seems to me as my recollection, we felt that there was an educational curve to this, a learning curve that our residents needed to become a part of and wrap their heads around, rather than this very complicated issue at the time of how many people are in my household, did my kids move back in with their kids, before Dad was living by himself, but now the kids are moved back in, or, I've already conserved 10%, and now you're going to start the clock after I've done that. I can't conserve more than that. All of those issues. To be fair, those were addressed earlier. We were the ones that opted to go to a sort of a flat program. But I don't see it as a panacea. I see it as the right thing to do and the right direction to move. And to some degree, that is what Commissioner Armenian was talking about, about this issue of trust, this issue of keeping faith with our ratepayers. So I am interested in hearing about it. How long will it take? It'll take $1 million worth. That's what we know.
Mr. Mayor, all I can say is I'm already in trouble. I live on a hill. I have 5 in my household, and tomorrow I'll have 6. My daughter's giving birth tomorrow, so I can't win.
Well, she's grandfathered in then.
Very good.
Well, I don't know if we're going to go to the sophistication of, being able to determine how much people are going to pay in hillsides or not, but what's fair is fair. It's about usage. If you use a lot of water and someone else doesn't use as much water, then I think society benefits when the person that doesn't use as much water, pays less. Period. It's just as simple as that. So how we get there, we'll see. There will be multiple ways to achieve our goals, but the idea that we don't want to do that, it just doesn't make any sense.
Per person or per household?
It would be per household. It would be per meter. Period.
These are some of the discussions. Well, how many people are living in your house? Well, 5. Well, how do we know? How many people? 5. Oh, you said there's 6. There's only 4.
You're going by usage. I'm not interested in who's living in the household. That goes for apartment buildings.
Yeah, but poor Mr. Weaver has 6 people, and
if he uses, he also has a really deep pool, I might add. If he uses more water, then he will pay more money. Period.
Well, 6 uses
Any
more
other
than
questions?
2.
We've really had some interesting discussions. I'm not sure you have a clear direction.
Well, unless there's direction to tell us to not proceed with the 218, we would proceed with the 218.
I'm prepared to respond with at least my opinion on that. I don't know if you want
Is
to
that
hear
not
it.
is that not an actual vote on the actual?
Oh, but like I say, if there was a desire to go a different route, to look at tiered first, then, again, tell us now before we go do the 218 noticing. That doesn't mean I'm asking you how you're going to vote, but ultimately, frankly, if there's not support to look at the rate increase, then why would we go through the noticing process?
It's too long. I support going ahead with 218.
Can you be opposed to the 218 but still be in favor of the rate increase?
You won't get a rate increase put before you.
You've got to go through the Prop 218 process to get to vote on a rate increase.
And let the public
understand
have something to say.
You can have us go through the Prop 218 rate increase process and still vote against it.
Correct.
But you can't do the opposite because you won't get a rate increase put before you without the 218 process.
That's correct.
Well, if you're polling council, is it appropriate to poll council at this point?
You're seeking direction.
Are you willing to hold a 218 rate increase hearing, Mr. Weaver?
Yes.
Mr. Draymond?
No.
I am in favor of holding a hearing. Ms. Friedman?
I don't know.
As I stated previously, no.
So we need to hear from you.
It's 2-2.
It's 2-2.
I just have one last question. Does this vote impact our bond rating, or is that done for the year?
Okay, and I'm glad you brought that up, because Bill Fox mentioned that earlier, and it's worth stating again. We have been put on notice that we are now having a negative outlook on GWP's water utility. And what that means is they have specifically mentioned the fact that our rates need to be adjusted. They basically assumed that unless we get a rate increase to stabilize what we've talked about today, that ultimately it will result in the downgrading of our rating. So even though we're still AA today, if we were to continue on for the rest of this year, there's a good possibility that we'll be downgraded. So that's what Fitch has told us, and that's what their negative outlook means.
And what would the downgrading end up costing the utility?
Well, what it means for us is that the interest rates that we'll pay for future bonding or any kind of future financial transactions will be higher.
And who would pay that interest? Ultimately, who would pay that interest?
Taxpayers.
Consumers will pay it, yes, customers.
If I can, the alternative is, though, you don't sell bonds until you've improved your financial position.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
The other alternative. I mean, you'd have to address this issue before you'd ever really be able to do any financing unless you're willing to go out and pay a higher interest rate. Right?
Well, there's a suggestion that we poll the commission
As well.
And ask for their input.
Mr. President, would you like to poll your commissioners and see
Yes,
what
I
they...
think that would be appropriate.
Why don't you go
Yes. My vote is yes to go for 218.
I will be in favor of it as well.
Take a comment. Was the suggestion of the rating agency to increase their worry is not what our rate is, their worry is what our reserve is, because that what justifies whether we're stable or not.
Reserves and operating revenues.
Right. So whether we have a rate increase or not, I don't think they care about that. They care about us having the proper reserve and the proper, revenue expense, or proper bottom line.
If I can, like Mr. Steiger, having attended many of these meetings with the rating agencies, my sense is they look at the willingness of the legislature to set the rates at a level that's adequate to fund your operations, fund your capital replacement, and fund your quantity needs, as well as establish reserves. So I don't think it's quite as simple as saying the reserve level is what they look at. They really look at the willingness of the agency to set the rates at a level that keeps the overall operation fiscally healthy from their standpoint, which is all of those things.
Yes,
right?
That is correct.
Thank you. No.
No.
Mr. Najarian, do we have, is GWP thinking that we may go out for bonding in the next 2-3 years? I mean,
Potentially, yes.
Within the next 2 or 3 years, is that correct? Not within the next year and a half?
It's well, depending, again, it's possible that we could within the next year to year and a half. That's correct, yes.
All right. But we have the opportunity to do whatever we need to do to have Fitch or Moody's or S&P give us a double A. Who knows, maybe we'll get up to triple A.
Okay, so the commission was 2-2.
Okay, well,
That doesn't help.
Well, my vote then, which is not my poll, which is not, just so people understand, this is not about an increase, this poll, it's about whether we're going to discuss an increase, would be yes. I think that given the impact that this could have on the rating of our utility, I mean, that's something that I think everyone would hate to see happen, to see our rating decrease. And maybe by the time you come back, there'll be other options. I would like to see, at the time that this rate discussion comes back, that we see what Mr. Starbird had suggested, not only the proposal for the rates, but also, again, what happens if we don't do it, if there's a way to find that money somehow within GWP to make up that difference so that we are not downgraded. I'd like to see that at the point at which this comes back.
Okay, and just to be, and we will absolutely do that, but to be clear, I believe at this point, Fitch has already put out their negative outlook, and regardless of what we do internally with our own funding, that's their outlook. Okay. But we will absolutely do that, and we'll also bring as many options as we can just generally in terms of what we would be looking at for a tiered structure. So we'll do that too.
And one other thing, when you come back, assuming that the choice is rate increase or not rate increase and cut, I'd like to see the cut part as sort of programmatic cuts. So what actual capital programs would you cut if you had to lay off employees? Who would you lay off? What would the ratepayers see in terms of reduced services if we don't increase the rates? So I think we need to really see it on that next level down. Okay?
Yep,
Thank you.
We'll do that.
Okay, if there's no further discussion for council, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Council's adjourned. Ryan,
Commission,
not done yet.
And Commission, is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Second. Commission is adjourned, please. Thank you.